Lawmakers said the fiscal 2026 defense bill would deliver the most significant acquisition reforms in a generation. But some of the most ambitious changes lawmakers were pushing for during negotiations didn't make it into the final bill. Still, some provisions that survived negotiations could meaningfully change how the Defense Department buys technology, especially from small businesses and non-traditional contractors. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more analysis. Anastasia, good to have you on.
Hi, Terry.
Let's talk first about some of those provisions that didn't make it into the bill.
So in the months leading up to the final passage of the bill, I was talking to people and the mood was kind of, this is a generational change. This is everything that everybody's been talking about for months and months. You know, the previous NDAA was focused on quality of life reforms. This NDAA was focused on acquisition. So people have been talking about it for almost a year. And what I was getting is that this bill will make acquisition different. It's kind of a great down payment on making things better in acquisition. But now that we have the final bill, some of the most kind of ambitious and sweeping proposals were dropped. So we talked about the right to repair. That gained momentum this year. This was not the first year right to repair efforts were being pushed by lawmakers, but this year it gained broad bipartisan support. It gained support from the Defense Department, but those provisions were ultimately stripped from the bill. Lawmakers also dropped an expanded definition of non-traditional contractors, which a lot of people were excited about. Both the House and Senate wanted to close the loophole that allows companies to submit cost and pricing data after price is agreed upon. And that effort, the lawmakers said the effort would empower the Defense Department to kind of enter into contracts with enough pricing information. But that never made it into the bill. They also wanted to rein in cost overruns, but the effort was also blocked. And another one that I wanted to highlight is a Senate proposal wanted to establish capstone requirements for future portfolio acquisition executives that never made it into the bill. And, you know, also a similar dynamic kind of unfolded within the Pentagon. We have this leaked draft acquisition memo that was circulating before Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was scheduled to give a speech to defense executives and senior military acquisition officials. It's available, everyone can read it, and everything that was laid out in the memo, it was pretty ambitious, but ultimately the final version was pretty watered down, and so was the department's acquisition transformation strategy that recently came out.
Anastasia, what do you think is behind the walkback of some of these really ambitious reforms? They had bipartisan support in negotiations.
So with the right to repair, there was a lot of industry pushback. And when I was talking to people, it was kind of, the consensus was that the industry won this fight this time. And, you know, when it comes to some of those acquisition reforms that were in the initial draft of the memo, it's hard to tell what exactly happened. It could be multiple things: industry pushback, Congress interfered, things like that. But ultimately, it's also possible that the draft memo that was circulating prior to Hegseth's speech, it's pretty possible that it was drafted a long time before it came out, so it was ultimately watered down.
Well, there are some provisions that did make it through. Which ones do you think have the greatest potential to transform DoD's acquisition process over the next year?
So there are a number of provisions that seek to streamline prototyping and ensure successful prototypes make it into production faster. And then another part to it is the bill gives more authority to consider small businesses and non-traditional contractors in award decisions. The bill, for example, exempts non-traditional defense contractors from some of the Pentagon's accounting, audit, and compliance requirements, and that will lower barriers to entry for a lot of defense companies. The legislation also expands the type of past performance that may be considered. The department will be required to accept a wider range of past performance, and that would include commercial and non-government work. In terms of changing the way prototypes make it into production, the bill expands the Pentagon's ability to use commercial solutions openings, and those are typically pretty difficult to transition, but the legislation allows the Defense Department to move those successful CSOs into production, including through sole source contracts. And then another one that I wanted to highlight is the bill gives combatant commanders the authority to experiment with, prototype, and demonstrate new technologies. And it also allows a successful experimentation or demonstration to serve as this justification for moving directly into production.
So those are some pretty significant changes. You mentioned earlier that the right to repair didn't make it in, but the right to repair is based on data and intellectual property access. So those are sometimes sensitive areas. Did the bill address those issues?
Yeah, so as we talked about, the right to repair provisions didn't make it, but lawmakers kind of offered this compromise, and the bill now requires the Defense Department to develop a digital system that would track and manage all technical data and then verify that contractors and some subcontractors comply with contract requirements related to technical data. And then it also requires DoD to review all of the existing contracts and to determine whether contracts delivered the data that they were required to. So some language that made it into the bill could suggest that the DoD might potentially have this authority to kind of re-engineer components when it thinks it would be quicker or cheaper. And so for a long time, both government and industry viewed this as a zero-sum game. There is no trust on both parties. And so as it keeps coming up in conversations, if DoD wants to address this issue in a meaningful way, the answer is addressing it from the very beginning of a program instead of looking at it after and the type of data that they would need.
It sounds like it's much easier to talk about wholesale acquisition reform than it is to implement it. As you look at DoD's procurement processes for 2026, what will you be watching?
So I think one thing that is really important to highlight here is the legislation doesn't really address the workforce, and it has a couple of provisions, but it doesn't really address it in a meaningful way. And the success of all of these reforms and everything that Hagseth put forward will depend on whether the Defense Department can equip their workforce with the skills needed to operate differently. Because the Defense Department attempted this kind of large acquisition push in the 90s, but the culture never adapted. The system quickly reverted to its old ways. What I'm being told is that without a broad, very aggressive workforce initiative, it's really hard to see how the workforce could have the confidence and take the risk that Congress and Hagseth want them to take. So we have reported on workforce morale, which is very low right now. We have reported on a large number of acquisition professionals exiting. So far, there is really nothing to suggest that there is a plan for how the department plans to equip the workforce, give them the skills needed to implement all of these reforms.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks so much for breaking all this down for us.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.